Hey there, my name is Robert, and let me answer the obvious first. Why is this white guy out here talking about race and racism? Well, unfortunately, people of color are, of course, the experts. I am not. It's important to acknowledge that. Here in the United States, being on the receiving end of racism is something that they have experienced, to some extent, all of their lives. But being respectful of that fact should not lead us white people to remain silent about what we do understand, particularly around other white people, and particularly now. And so, here I am, talking. You may have already picked up on the fact that I'm picturing myself speaking to a white audience. This is not to exclude people of color, it's just that since I think white people are the ones who need to hear what I have to say the most, I'm directing my messages toward them. And with that said, welcome to Row Talks Race. Today we are in southern Pennsylvania at Caledonia State Park. Caledonia is over 1,000 acres surrounded by state forest. There's a popular theater here. The Appalachian Trail passes through Caledonia, but Caledonia is best known to be where Thaddeus Stevens built his iron furnace in the 1800s. Now, how is that relevant to us? Well, again, we're in southern Pennsylvania, not far from the Mason-Dixon line, and the ironmaster at the furnace was a conductor for the Underground Railroad. The premise of Row Talks Race is that we white folks are taught from an early age to distance ourselves from racism, that this is a long-standing problem and that this needs to change. In this first episode, I'm going to be talking about a powerful idea that lays the foundation for this distancing. All right, Ro, let's have it, you say. What's the problem? In just a moment. First, you need to know something about my starting point. I was born here in Pennsylvania in the mid-1970s. By that time, a lot of progress toward racial equality had already been accomplished. Add to that the fact that I grew up in a mostly white community where I was not confronted with the problems that remained. I believe my textbooks were the only place I saw racism. And to some extent, maybe that was true. See, these things led me to be insulated. I had a certain narrow viewpoint on this, and there wasn't much to challenge it. All right, let's turn to that foundational idea I mentioned and start to change all that. Here it is. The single most damaging thing that white people are taught in childhood about race hate and racial inequality is that it was all a very long time ago. Much of what we learn about race and racism is subtly implied, but I think this point is made pretty clear. At least for me it was. And with that insulated childhood I mentioned, it was also easy to believe. In a future segment, I talk about habits we white people have which distance us from racism. And this idea that we are beyond all of that opens the doors to many opportunities to dismiss problems in the present. And it's a tough sticking point. You see, having an incorrect understanding or framing of something is much more difficult to fix than if we had simply learned a wrong fact. If it was just a single fact, we could learn the right name or date, no big deal, move on with things. But having a wrong understanding of something, that can be so incorporated into how we think and who we are that we can feel threatened when it is challenged. But that is exactly what I am doing right now. It was not all a very long time ago. For heaven's sakes, nothing involving Europeans on this continent was that long ago. The United States is actually a very young country. But because my initial understanding was distorted, I have to remind myself of that sometimes. It's sort of an exercise I go through. And for it to be most effective, I put myself in the middle of the timeline. I remind myself of things like my great-grandfather, my dad's grandfather. He's the first man in my paternal line who I never met. I knew my dad, I met my grandfather, but the first person I never met was born, before the start of the Civil War. And my dad himself, he was born during the Great Depression, but a few years before the start of World War II. So consider what that means. When he was born, the Holocaust hadn't happened yet. And you remember the story of the young black girl who desegregated that elementary school in Louisiana, and all those white people were outside blocking the door and being ugly and yelling horrible things to her and throwing things at her? Well, that was like 100 years ago, right? No. When that happened, my mom was in high school. And that woman, Ruby Bridges, yeah, she's still alive. When in my head, I use examples like these to correct my distorted timeline, then suddenly everything happening today makes a lot more sense. Slavery was such a powerful institution, so woven into the fabric of our country and who we were as white people. Of course, it's going to take more than a couple of generations to work our way out of that and the segregation that followed. When I consider that social change comes not following votes won or documents signed, but following the implementation of those changes, then suddenly, being born in the decade following the advances of the civil rights movement in the 60s feels very different. It feels important, like a critical time even. But it took me almost half my life to realize that. All right, time out. At this point, famous YouTubers everywhere are freaking out, saying, "Ro, man, you need to start wrapping this stuff up. Statistically speaking, your viewers are about to leave you and go watch a funny cat video or something." Well, my viewers, stick around, because the most important thing I have to say is right now. All of this leads to why I am making these videos. If I had held on to that so long ago understanding, I would have turned out to be a very different white person with very different conclusions about what is going on in our country right now. It's clear to me that there are many other white people raised with initial worldviews similar to my own that are not allowing it to be challenged. They're holding on tight to it with both hands, insisting that the United States is what they believed it to be in childhood, and damn the consequences. Why do I say that? Look at the last few years. While inequality and brutality against people of color were highlighted, at the very time we white people should have come together to make positive change, we worked against each other. Some white people doubled down on the denial, even going so far as to try to convince other white people that the very act of acknowledging and talking about race makes racism worse. This bizarre claim shuts down conversation, sabotaging attempts to get to know other races better, and potentially to right wrongs. And that is why Ro Talks Race exists, to push back against the distancing and the denial. My hope is that as we begin to think and talk about race and racism in productive new ways, that we will start choosing to move forward, addressing the powerful ripple effects of slavery that remain. This, I believe, is our duty as white people to our country and our fellow Americans. Hey everyone, thank you much for watching to the end of this video. I do so appreciate your time. I know I'm new to this whole YouTube thing and I don't have the editing and sound down just perfect, but hey, we have a lot to talk about. So I'm not gone anywhere, which means I have plenty of time to practice and get it right. Hit subscribe, share this with others, and I do hope to talk to you again soon.